right, guys, we're going to get started. First of all, I'm Michelle Holder. I'm an assistant professor of economics here at John Jay. And it is my distinct pleasure and extreme honor to introduce Dr. Lenore Palladino, who will be our speaker today. She's going to be speaking about Towards Economic Democracy, which sounds a little general, but Lenore will take us through it. Lenore is also currently the Vice President of Policy and Outreach at Demos, leading a campaign-oriented approach to Demos's issue advocacy work. Prior to joining Demos, Lenore was the organizing director at MoveOn.org. At MoveOn.org, Lenore helped mobilize millions of Americans to participate in campaigns regarding voting rights and democracy reform, economic justice, and the 2008, 2010, and 2012 election cycles. And she also helped mobilize Americans regarding health care and women's rights. In addition, her previous work experience includes leading successful union organizing drives with CSEA-AFSCME, community organizing with the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, and as National Director of United Students Against Sweatshops. Not against workshops, this is a workshop. Lenore received her bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. However, in order to tell you about Lenore's education after college, allow me to tell you a little story. And for my students who are here, you guys know I like to tell little stories. And one of my students is raising his hand. Put your hand down. Put it down. So I've known Lenore for about 8 years now. We were both doctoral students in economics at the New School for Social Research together. And I even crashed at her mom's house once when there was a graduate student conference taking place in her hometown in Massachusetts. We were both puttering along in the PhD program when, seemingly out of nowhere, Lenore announces to me that she's going to law school. I thought to myself, okay. So I finished the PhD program in 2013 before Lenore, wondering what she's up to, because after she went off to law school, she was very busy and I didn't hear from her as often. Meanwhile, Lenore not only finishes her PhD last year in economics, but in the interim and in her spare time, also gets her Juris Doctor, or JD degree from Fordham University, my undergraduate alma mater. I think to myself. Now, well before Lenore finishes her PhD, she ends up getting a job at this organization that I mentioned called Demos. The thing about this nonprofit organization, Demos, is before I started the economics doctoral program, I had been there 6 years as a director. So I leave Demos as a mere director, and several years later, Lenore is hired and is quickly promoted to vice president, actually within a year. I say to myself again. All right. So finally, before I finished my doctoral degree in 2011, actually I finished it in 2013, I give birth to my little daughter, who my students know that I've mentioned a few times in my class. I give birth to my little daughter in 2011 and I become a mom. Next thing you know, I hear from Lenore, who tells me not only did she have a daughter too, but she got married. Now, as the rapper 50 Cent would say, and Lenore, this is the only time you're going to get introduced with 50 Cent, and I'm going to invoke Kanye West. As the rapper 50 Cent would say, Lenore was teaching me how to stunt. And as Kim Kardashian's hubby, Kanye, would say, Lenore stayed stunting. So please allow me to introduce you all to a good friend of mine and a constant reminder of my inadequacies, Dr. Lenore Palladino, JD. Give her a round of applause.
Good afternoon. My name is Lenore. Never have a friend introduce you to others. That's a reminder to never do that. Michelle. I'm really happy to be here. As Michelle said, I work at a public policy organization called Demos, where we work at the intersection of economic justice, racial justice, and democracy. And I'm also an economist. I got my PhD just recently, so I'm also consider myself part of the academic fold, but I'm here today really on behalf of the work that I do at this think tank, a public policy organization called Demos. I'm going to try to be really participatory in this conversation, so I know many of you, this is sort of in between midterms. I apologize that I chose today to be here. You're eating, and that's great. But I am going to be participatory for two reasons. One is I have lost my voice, so as you can hear, it's going in and out. I'm on the tail end of a flu, and so I'm going to need you all to talk as much as I talk. And two, more importantly, because I actually really believe in participatory conversations. I believe that learning economics, in particular, needs to be grounded in conversations about real people's lives and real communities, and not just graphs on a blackboard. And because the subject I'm going to talk about is called economic democracy. It's really around how we all could participate differently in a new economic system. So it actually requires participation. So what I'm going to do is a couple things. I'm going to have to drink more water than usual because of the flu thing. Whenever spring arrives, we will all be so happy about that. I'm going to first talk a little bit about what is this phrase that I'm mentioning, economic democracy. What does that even mean? What is this framework? Then I'm going to give some examples, and I'm really curious about if you all have heard about any of them. This is actually not the type of stuff we tend to study in our economics programs, unfortunately. So I'm going to talk about some examples and hopefully ground us. And then I'm going to talk, because I do public policy work, I'm going to talk about the types of policies that exist right now in our economy, but that we could actually broaden. And I'm sure some of you here are taking economics courses for all kinds of reasons. Probably some of you are interested in the rampant economic equality we have in our country right now, thinking about what could you do with a college degree or a graduate degree or a law degree to help solve some of these problems that are very deep and real. One path that people take is going into doing public policy work. That you might only have a very vague idea of what that even means, but really it's about being part of the process of passing laws and regulations and bills that build in sort of new structures into our economy. So those are the last part. So economic democracy, does anyone want to take a stab at what that might refer to at all? What do you think about, what does those two words together actually sound like to you? There's no wrong or right answer here. Yes, Dr. Holmes.
Equality.
Uh-huh.
Equality.
Yep.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, equality. Right. Anybody else? Yeah, right here.
Give people the ability to vote for the kind of economic system they want to live in.
Uh-huh. So giving people the ability to vote and participate in creating the kind of economic system they want to live in. So one more, I'll take one more. Somebody was up there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, dialogue and workplace decisions.
Yep, dialoguing and workplace decisions, right. So the way that I think about, I have to remember to go forward on these slides here. These are just going to be very basic words up on the chart. I apologize, it's not too pretty. So I think about economic democracy as a framework for how all of us should have ownership and participation or control in our economy. This can take place at the sort of enterprise level, by which I really mean the workplace or a government agency or sort of a specific institutional level, or it can take place across a broader economic system. Economic democracy, I think, is something that can exist sort of within the broader capitalist structure that we live in. It also can be part of changing the broader capitalist structure that we live in. It's a framework that actually exists in many ways right now in our country and around the world, but not nearly at the level of scale where you probably heard about it in your undergraduate classes. So at the most sort of simple level, it's really a framework of ownership and participation in the economy. It actually has deep roots in this country and around the world. I'll talk about some examples later, but just want to give you a tiny bit of context. Professor Gordon Nembhard, who teaches here, I apologize if I'm pronouncing her name wrong, she's written an incredible book that I would encourage you all to read called Collective Courage, and done some really groundbreaking research into the deep roots and history in the African American experience in the United States, in which many different forms of economic democracy were actually practiced. So what do I mean by this? I mean cooperatives where people were coming together and forming into communities farming communities where they could help sustain each other in an economy that was obviously quite difficult for African Americans after the Civil War. Consumer cooperatives where people can come together and bulk purchase products. So rather than all of you going to the store separately and buying, you know, whatever, Coke, Pepsi, flour, whatever you buy. What do college students eat? I don't know. I subsisted on pizza when I was in college. We would all go and buy together, and that would be a form of a consumer cooperative. So, you know, I'm not going to try to talk too much about her, or really at all about her research. I would really encourage you, if you're at all interested, to read it. And I know she's gives talks on it here, I'm sure, as well as teaches classes. But I think there's a really deep-rooted history of economic democracy practices in the United States that we should be aware of. And also, at the beginning of sort of the, you know, around the American Revolution, when Jefferson and sort of the initial white male founders of the political democracy were debating with all of the problems inherent of who got to debate and be part of those conversations, they were also thinking actually a lot about economic democracy. There was a lot of debates that I have only learned about recently around if we should even have, you know, private corporations in this country, if banks should be public or private. Things that today we think just sound so obvious. Of course, banks are on Wall Street and they're not owned by the government. That would be insane, right? But at the beginning of the country, there was a lot of conversations about what it would mean for wealth to be so concentrated in the hands of so few people. So I think it was great they had those conversations. There's a lot of reasons why, markets and having private actors and private enterprises really, create an economy together. There's a lot of good things about that and efficiencies that brings for society. But there's obviously been a lot of trade-offs in terms of the increasing concentration of wealth in our society. So, I think of economic democracy as actually a verb and not a noun. What do I mean by that? I mean that I don't think so much about economies as like what you might call in a class a steady state. I don't know if you guys talk about that much in your classes, but the idea that there's some perfect point at which the economy is, sitting there functioning, and you can sort of see it as a noun. I actually think about economies in general as verbs. They are created through daily practices, daily decisions by governments, daily decisions by corporations. So I think about economic democracy the same way. So just for a second, though, why are we even talking about economic democracy in the first place? I won't read these out, but I assume a lot of you, you live in New York, you understand that there is a lot of inequality in our economy today in the United States. And, for many of us who have grown up sort of in the 80s and, since then, we actually take a lot of this for granted, but we, learn and know in a lot of our courses, both economics and political science and history and everything, that, this actually, we're in a specifically extreme period of economic inequality in this country. It's segregated by race, it's segregated by gender, it's even segregated by geography at times. So just for example, we see the unemployment rate is currently 12.6% among African American men in the country. We know that the total income that's been created in the country since in the last 30 years has been nearly entirely captured by the 1%. This is all sort of stuff that you all are generally aware of, talking about in your classes. Yes, no, yes, okay, great. So this is the problem, right? There's lots of different answers to what to do about it. There's familiar solutions. When I say the familiar solutions, I'm showing my bias as a progressive at a progressive policy organization, where the solutions that we talk about are things like raising wages, strengthening collective bargaining and unionization, creating more robust safety net, and having stronger regulation in the economy. I think all of that is incredibly important. But what it doesn't actually encompass is increased ownership and increased participation in the economic structures that we all live in every day. So that's where we're trying to go further. So again, I was talking about it before, but what is economic democracy? I actually think about it, it's like framework, okay, what do we mean? It's very sort of different highfalutin concepts. We all live in a political democracy. We understand that to be, what it means is that people who are citizens, who are part of a community or a country, have the ability to vote and participate in the community in which they, in which they're members of. We have, a sense that we own the public goods that are part of our country. So, our public schools, our public services, we all, as the taxpayers and the voters, have an ownership stake over those resources. And we also have a participation stake by voting. Clearly, there's many challenges to political participation in the United States. But economic democracy is really just an extension of political democracy in the sense that it's the same idea. It's the idea that people within a workplace should be able to actually have some level of ownership over what's created, the wealth that's created in that company or in that enterprise, and also have some way to participate about the decisions that are made of how that enterprise is run. Does that make sense to folks? If people sort of see the parallel that I'm trying to make between political democracy and economic democracy? Okay, any questions or reactions or thoughts sort of at this particular point? All right. So I think actually that both ownership and control or participation are necessary for economic democracy. We have a bunch of policies right now that encourage some form of ownership, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit later. And then actually separately, we actually have a whole structure in our economy that's about participation in the workplace. Does anyone know what I might be referring to? Anyone themselves a union member or a family have family that's a union member? DC 37, CSCA, transit, yeah?
I don't have a family member,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking about Starbucks because those that work for Starbucks, they own a share in the business. But once you are for giving the job, they give you stock meetings, and with those, when you own a share of the whole, corporation. I thought only
Yep.
that comes back.
Yep, that's interesting. I didn't know that Starbucks actually did that, but that's a policy I'm going to talk about. Basically, what you're saying is when you start to work in a place, you get your wage, right? You get your paycheck that comes to you every 2 weeks, but you also get a share of the company. And what that means is you are a part owner, and you should then be making some percentage of the profit that company makes, which should go back to you. Unions are, declining in this country in terms of membership, but still a very, important force. And where people are working in a unionized workforce, they have some ability to participate in how how the company is run, really to the extent of how they, their workplace conditions are. So they bargain with their employer over, the hours that they work and the conditions under which they work. So that's a form of participation. But what's, I think the case currently is in most workplaces at economic enterprises today in the United States, we might have a little bit of ownership, we might have some participation, but we very rarely have both. And actually, it's having both together that allows for, reduced inequality. All right. So what this actually calls, I think, into question, and I want to talk about just for a second, is what's the purpose of a corporation? Did any of the classes here really look at this question of what the purpose of a corporation is and sort of how it's commonly understood today? Anybody want to take a stab at what's the purpose of a corporation in the economy? How do we think about it? So the most common understanding today is that a corporation exists really to create profit for its shareholders. So if you read the paper or you hear sort of about, there's oftentimes sort of what corporations are reporting on is how their stock is doing, right? So if you take, Coca-Cola, they're less reporting on how many, cans of soda they've sold. They're actually reporting on how their shares go up and down in the stock market. Professor Mason here has done some really important work on unpacking and understanding sort of what we call financialization, which is the idea that corporations are no longer sort of measured by what they produce and what services they sell to you or goods they sell to you. And they're certainly not measured on how many jobs they create, what wages they pay their workers, or how they function in a community. What they are measured by the economy, how they are evaluated, is how their shares are sold on the stock market, how much money they're making for their shareholders. So, public corporations generally are owned by their shareholders. Private corporations, it's a little different, but basically the same idea. They're measured by how much money they're making for their owners. So this can be a double-edged sword, right? Because the argument that I'm actually making in some ways is that we actually should encourage more ownership, that more of us who are participating in an economic enterprise should be owners. So in some ways that, incentivizes all of us to have corporations, benefit their owners. Right now what's happening is that the ownership of corporations is held by a very, very small group of people, right? Relatively, at least the largest share. So you might, if you go on and you invest in a 401k in a job or something, you'll own a very small percentage of the share, but most of us will not own the vast majority of shares of the corporation. So I think what part of how I think about economic democracy, and really, just coming back to constantly this question of what will help alleviate inequality in our country, is a different answer. We need to have a different answer for what a corporation is and who it serves. It needs to serve the society at large. It needs to be job creating. It needs to sell people goods and services that they actually need, and not just be measured and not just be accountable to a very small group of shareholders. And then at the same time, more of us need to be owners. More of us need to be actually benefiting from the gains. So I'm looking at the clock. And
I've got you.
I know. Okay, so
Yeah,
speed up.
I've got you.
So let me give you a few examples, and I'll go a little faster through this. Has anyone heard of Mondragon? Anybody know why I might be mentioning it here? Yeah, in the blue shirt. Yeah.
My professor mentioned it. I think is that the company that everybody there is like the owner of the
Exactly. So Mondragon is it's a city in the Basque region of Spain, and it's really become famous for being the place in the world where there's the highest concentration of economic democracy, really. So there's worker co-ops and different forms of businesses where all the employees there own and participate in the running of the businesses. It's been around for about 50 years. It has about 75,000 employees, and it's the 10th largest corporation in Spain. So, in the United States, we have very little sort of examples where we might hear about worker cooperatives or employees being owners of businesses. It's not very present in our economy, but in other parts of the world, it's actually much more present. So one example is in Spain, or it's the largest example, and really they have things there like they set a ratio between the wages of the lowest paid worker and the highest paid worker. So in some cases it's 3-to-1, in some cases it's 9-to-1. That is light years different from what we have in this country today. You can imagine what CEOs of, if you go and work at Starbucks, what is Howard Schultz making versus what you're making as a barista. That is not 3-to-1, that is 100-to-1 or whatever. So they've actually, specifically set up this large corporation that's made up of a lot of smaller businesses within it that's done a lot to reduce inequality within that community, within that region of Spain. And it's been really successful. Another example here, just to touch on it really quickly, is in Reading, Pennsylvania. Anybody from Reading or near Reading, know where it is? Okay, I don't really, it's somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania, so I was going to see if somebody would correct me. But it's a small community, and if any of you are from sort of the Great Lakes region or the Midwest of this country, there's a lot of small towns and cities that have really been struggling since manufacturing has declined in the United States. So Reading is a small city where the mayor has said, okay, attracting businesses to create jobs and by giving them big tax benefits hasn't worked. They've mostly created a few jobs and then left a couple years later. And trying to get big Wall Street banks to invest in our city also hasn't worked. They charge us huge fees. They get us to invest in financial products that then crashed in the Great Recession. So this is a city where there's a 36% poverty rate, but a 6% unemployment rate, which means that people there are working poor. They're working, but they're not making any kind of livable salary on those jobs. So the mayor has invested in this new strategy of really trying to create economic democracy within the city, creating publicly owned banks, which can actually service the community, and rather than that money going back to Citibank or Wall Street, that money is channeled into the local economy, so people can get, for example, student loans at a 0% interest rate. I don't know if any of you have student loans. I have quite a few. They're not at 0%. They're creating new types of waste management systems where it used to be outsourced to some corporation that was headquartered in New York. People would come in and work and then leave the community. They've set up a public entity, so they're creating new jobs that are paid $10.10 an hour, so that people are actually making a livable wage doing work right there in the community. So there's some examples right now. There's a, anybody heard of the Cooperative Home Care Associates in the Bronx?
Yeah. Your co-op.
Right. So the largest cooperative in the United States is actually here in the Bronx. It's called Cooperative Home Care Associates. They're home care attendants. And it's both a worker co-op, which means that all the workers there collectively own the business, collectively decide on who the management is and how they're going to run the business. And they're also unionized, so they also, they have hierarchy still within the business. They have management and people who are, doing the frontline work. They have a union that negotiates over their wages and working conditions. So there's cooperatives here in New York City as well. There's also, around the country right now, again, going back to, I think, the roots of this, in a lot of predominantly African-American communities in the South, such as Jackson, Mississippi, and Richmond, Virginia, there's sort of new political leadership that is thinking about how do you, again, given the rampant, racial wealth gap that we see in terms of inequality in this country, how do we create more forms of economic ownership that create less, that builds wealth for people in communities where they are. So, one kind of quick last example I'll give you, and then maybe I'll try to summarize some of the other policy solutions and open it up. Has anybody heard of benefit corporations? Discuss that at all? No. All right. So benefit corporations, again, is going back to this idea that mainly corporations right now are understood to be for their shareholders. They're so that a shareholder gets a payout once a year, essentially, from the profit that firm produced. That's how they're measured. This new idea of a benefit corporation means that a corporation should actually serve what they call a triple bottom line. So it should be about making money, right? It's still about some wealth created for the shareholders. It's also about serving, essentially being sustainable. So in sort of this moment of trying to figure out what to do about climate change, how do businesses play a role in climate change, they're supposed to serve a material positive impact on the environment, which means looking for ways to reduce waste, looking for ways to reduce emissions. And they're also supposed to play an overall positive impact on the community, the society. So what that means is, for example, a lot of the large corporations we have right now, Walmart, they pay people so little that people actually have to continue to be on public assistance in order to sustain their families when they work at Walmart. So the salary you're making at Walmart is actually not only not paying you what you should make for doing that job, but also is draining the community's tax dollars further, because people also have to stay on public assistance while working full time, or people have to stay on it to be part of, they don't get health care, so they have to be on their Obamacare system. It's draining tax dollars. So this idea of a benefit corporation reverses that and says that corporations should also be responsible for building wealth in the community, should be part of, increasing the amount of money and revenue that's going into the community rather than draining it out. So this is actually a new idea. It's voluntary. Corporations can decide they do it because it's something they choose to do out of the goodness of their heart, or because they think probably more, frankly, that it's going to help their image, their brand. They want to market themselves as a company that's going to be good for the community, good for the environment, because they think that'll get them more customers. So this is a new example as well of where it's not, a company that's fully owned by a set of employees, but it's changing the way in which we understand what corporations are actually for, by creating this triple bottom line. And it's actually been passed in 27 states, so it's a new and growing idea. Does that make sense? Any questions about what that triple bottom line idea is, or why it would be different from what we have right now? Mm-hmm.
If we get to become shareholders in a company, right? And there are things like that now. Isn't it that we won't be
It's a really good point. So I think there's, two ways to think about it. One is, in a lot of cases, when corporations have said, okay, we will create it so that our employees can become part owners, what they do is then reduce the wage that people are making, or reduce the wage and benefits mix that people are making. So essentially where you end up is in the same place where you started, except now you're actually taking on the risk of the corporation. So instead of you making $10 an hour straight, no matter what's going on in the economy, how it goes up and down, now you're making $5 an hour and a share of profit, which in a good year could mean you're making $12 an hour, and in a bad year could mean you're making $8 an hour. So, I think that that's a really important point. I'm not quite sure if that's exactly what you're getting at, but where these types of practices have been put in place in a way that, because it wasn't thought through as carefully as it should have been, left people in the same place. And then another way to think about it is that if you as an employee own such a small amount of the share of the corporation, but sort of outside shareholders still own 99% of the shares, then yes, they're still obviously going to make most of the benefit of that, of what goes to shareholders, of the profits that go to shareholders. So there is also a question of, how employee-owned is a business. If a business is, 90% still owned by outside shareholders, but 10% owned by employees, there's still going to be that imbalance. And that's why, what a lot of people who are looking at this is saying is, how do we actually get to a point where there's actual full employee ownership, or at least majority employee ownership? Because again, for me, it goes back to this thing of there's ownership, but if you also can't participate in how the business is run, then you actually aren't able to improve the chances that the business is going to do well. So ownership and participation actually really need to go together. Yeah.
So which one is better? Would you rather have minimum wage, or would you rather say more money?
I think, what I would say is I think that if we are able, it's not just about one business at a time. I think if we are able to create more wealth for more people by people becoming owners of, becoming part owners of their businesses, as long as there's also some way in which they're improving how their businesses are run, then people are going to be better off. If people are simply taking on more risk by becoming a part owner, and they don't have, the ability to help influence if that business is going to be successful, then they're just taking on more risk for themselves, and that might not make them any better off, certainly, than they were before. And in any case, that that person would have to make that judgment about how much risk they want to take on. So, I think that a lot of this, where I started out, it actually also comes back to public policy, where public policy has to play an important role in terms of making sure that if people become owners within their business, that they have the right kind of information, that the setup is right, so that they're not, losing out in the end. Is that what you were getting at? No? Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you think this whole idea of risk plays into
And so the whole idea of
like how companies now offer employees 401ks or pension. Like how much this affects that.
Yeah.
whole kind of thing that we're saying.
Yep. I think that that's also, part of this larger shift that we're all experiencing and in the middle of, where people's jobs and livelihoods are, less secure and more privatized. So whereas, you used to get, in many cases, a actual pension from your job, a defined amount of money after you retired, now your money is invested in the stock market. And, that can go up and down. There's good years and bad years. And if you were someone who had all of your retirement savings invested in the stock market in 2008 and you were planning to retire that year, things were not going to go so well for you. I think that, part of what we're seeing too is just there's so much imbalance of information. How much do people actually know about how the stock market works? It's one of the reasons why I love economics, actually. It's as nerdy and geeky as that makes me sound. I feel like we don't, learn enough about how finance works. We don't learn enough about how economics works. Maybe you all do now, but I didn't have an economics course in high school at all. There was no, study of that. It was biology, chemistry, and physics, but there was nothing about how the economy works. So I think we have also just a real lack of understanding. about what it even means to have your, retirement savings invested in the first place. So I know you all have midterms and you have other things you need to do. So I want to, maybe because I've been taking a couple questions, say a couple more things.
Absolutely.
And then see if we'll go. That's okay. All right. So I've been sort of mentioning this, but I just wanted to give you a sense of, because these might be terms or words you've heard floating around. This idea of employee ownership is actually, it's actually more common in the economy right now than most people know, and even than most economists know. There's a set of professors at Rutgers University in New Jersey who have done a lot of the really interesting research around how prevalent, how common employee ownership actually is in American corporations. So they found that actually 40% of American workers participate in some sort of employee ownership or profit sharing. So employee ownership can look a lot of different ways. It can be a worker co-op, a worker cooperative, which essentially means that everyone who works there is a co-owner. There's only 200 of those in the United States right now. It's really, we have a big problem of scale of how do you actually get those kinds of businesses the money, the capital they need to expand and grow. Then we have what are called employee stock ownership plans, which are related to 401ks and related to retirement savings, where essentially you are kind of vested as an owner in your business, and you get the share of that wealth, the share of the capital of that company when you retire. That's actually the most common form of employee ownership. So if you end up working somewhere after school and you hear an ESOP, you should look into it more because you want to know where your money and where your wealth is being used, how it's being handled. Then there's other options where really right now the idea of being able to own a larger share of stock or having the choice to purchase stock if it's at a certain price, which is what a stock option is, really that option only exists at the top level of companies. So CEOs, upper managers on Wall Street, those people are technically also employers of companies. It is, excuse me, totally common for those people to be paid and to be, half of their salary is coming out of being an owner, a partial owner in that company. And those are folks who have a lot of incentive, a lot of ability to participate in how the business is run. They've been able to make quite a lot of money by being partial owners in these firms, right? So, it's an option where, on the one hand, people who are doing the regular work of a company don't have the option right now generally to own, but people who are management in the company do. And so that's, again, a case of, that's part of why we have this, widening inequality in this country is this imbalance of who owns and who doesn't. Profit sharing is just a little different. It means that you're not an owner, but you get a share of the profit each year. So it's sort of fairly similar, but functions a little bit different. We're going to talk much more about that. Sharing. And then finally, a lot of the examples that I've used have been more about kind of what happens for you at your particular workplace. There's also many other ways to think about this broader idea of economic democracy. How to create systems that are more people are able to own and participate in the economic structures within our community. So I won't talk much about each of these, but just to mention them to you just in case they are useful in terms of understanding this concept. One is this idea of a public bank. So does anyone know that there is actually, has anyone heard before that there's actually a public bank in the United States, a bank that's owned by a state government? Anybody? Yeah, you guys? Yeah.
North Dakota.
There's one in North Dakota. It was formed about 100 years ago. It's called the Bank of North Dakota. And what it does is, we just have this idea, like, of course, banks are Wall Street and they're making tons of money and that's just how it should be and how it is. No, this is a bank that everyone who lives in North Dakota gets a share of the income it makes every year. It comes back into their into their checking account. If you grow up there and you're going to college in North Dakota, you can take out a student loan at 0% interest rate. If any of you have loans and they're not at 0% interest rate, that is because you do not have a public bank here in New York. And really, just more importantly, it's a way to invest in the community. It's a bank that can lend money to new forms of businesses, can invest in the types of businesses that help grow wealth for the broad community. So public banking is another form of economic democracy. I'll skip the anchor institution one. But a final one you might have heard about if you live in certain parts of the city is an idea called participatory budgeting. And this actually started out in Brazil and has been really successful there and has been adopted in different parts of the world. And particularly right now, a lot of people are experimenting with it in New York. What it means is, rather than our city council members being the ones who have the sole authority about deciding how the budget of the city of New York is spent, there is a process by which anyone who lives in a neighborhood, can be part of deciding how the wealth and how the budget for that community is spent. So in Brooklyn, for example, they had a series of community meetings. They distributed ballots throughout the community, and people were able to decide amongst a set of different community projects. There was a lot of organizing that went on. Not everybody was happy with the result, but there was really robust community participation. So it wasn't just sort of, the city council members on high deciding. It was actually the members of the community, again, who, in theory, we own our public resources, having a more robust way to participate in the decisions of of how their public dollars are spent. So participatory budgeting, I think it's going to grow even more in New York City, and it's something that we need to keep an eye on. So I hope this was a useful framework. I know we have just a few minutes for questions, not very many, or comments. I really would love to hear people's thoughts or feedback on this. So I saw one, and then two over there, and then three.
This is not questions for the announcement. I'm working for the Cuba Service Corp and participatory budgeting is going on currently. We're going to have board meeting from the 11th to the 19th, and chances are many of you reside within the districts that's going to be held on. So look out for it. Go to the City Council website and go to PD, participatory budgeting.
Great.
The bank in North Dakota that he was talking about, how does that work? Like, do you have to be born in North Dakota, or do you have
To get that certificate, you have to do that. Yeah, and you have to go to school there. So you choose to move to North Dakota. Yeah, it's unfortunately not. I think we have I could spend a whole other hour talking about the student loan crisis we have in this country, where we're not even able to refinance our interest rates on our loans. That's a whole other problem. But yes, you do have to be from North Dakota and go to school there. Yeah.
You spoke about union being like one of the ways you can become more economically democratic. Are there any negatives to that? Like, I'm assuming that it must be negatives if everyone has a union for a job. Are there any problems that could create?
There hasn't been many situations that I know of where everyone is unionized, so I don't know what would happen under that circumstance. What I think generally unions have been found to strengthen people's wages, and more importantly, from my experience doing union organizing, people's experience of feeling valued and dignified at work. I think the trade-off can be around when you have part of a company that's unionized and you have part of a company that isn't, how that sort of plays out within those two sets of workers. But I think what we have right now is actually decreasing unionization, not increasing unionization. So it's sort of hard to say what the counterfactual problems would be if we were going in the other direction. But it's a good question. Yeah, for sure. Good.
We have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, fine.
So you can take a few.
Yeah, okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
So for a corporation that's maybe, or a business that's just coming up, right, starting, how do you get to a place that you receive enough money to have shareholders come into your business?
A lot of startup businesses are looking for capital. They're looking for investments. And so what they have to do is really show to investors that they're creating a product or a service that would be of interest to a lot of consumers. So there's a lot of different ways in which people attract that kind of investment. A lot of times people who are at the who are around at the beginning of the formation of a corporation end up being the owners, because they end up, they're the ones who put in their initial investment to make that business thrive. There's a lot of different ways that businesses choose, a lot of businesses choose to stay private, which means they don't actually, sell their shares on the open market. They don't become owned by shareholders through sort of the open market. But there's a lot of different forms by which people find that kind of investment over time.
I think we can take one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap up at about 2:40 or before. So,
Go ahead.
Hi, do you think that's beneficial for the worker? Because since you're saying that they're going to cut their salary, what about the vice president and the president of the corporation? He's going to be able to cut his salary, or he's going to be the same.
Right, I mean, my point actually is that it doesn't have to be that it cuts people's salaries, that ownership can actually be structured in a way that you end up benefiting from it, where you're receiving the wage you were receiving before, and you're an owner as well. You know, you increase your ownership, you know, within a firm. You know, what happens at the senior level in terms of a vice president or president, there's a lot of people trying to create public policy regulations right now where they aren't able to just be compensated at, you know, whatever level they and their boards decide, because again, that extremity between their compensation and everybody else's compensation right now is so broad. I don't know if that gets at what your question was, but.
We can take one final one if there's a burning question.
Yes, Dave?
Can you explain like quickly what's the difference? Like right now it's 1% who cares about shared profits, but then we have 90% of people who also care. The point is the same. People will care how much profit corporation makes. It's the same system, but more people want to have higher profits.
I would argue that that actually is a pretty different system than what we have today. It would actually change the way that, you know, the way I look at it is fundamentally how are people's lives going to be affected? How are they going to be able to sustain themselves and their families? And it would actually be a pretty different outcome if we had more people, you know, benefiting overall from profit being made tonight. So we can agree to disagree. So thank you very much. And this was in between all the classes.